when somebody comes to me and says, hey, I just got out of university, I'm 23, and I think I'm going to buy a business instead of get a job, what I'll do is I'll point out that they can get paid to develop experience, knowledge, and wisdom with no risk. And that's by getting a job. And so what I'll say to them is like, look at what you might be interested in. Look at the array of industries that are out there. And look at whether those industries are dominated by these big companies or there's a plethora of small independent operators out there. Well, if you think that you might like auto repair and you think you might want to own an auto repair business, well, get a job in that world and learn what it's really like. Learn what those challenges are that people face in those businesses. Get to know people who might be able to help you.
You're listening to Before You Buy or Sell a Business, hosted by Jared Johnson, the top SBA lender in the country. On this show, we break down business acquisitions, talk to industry pros, and provide real-world advice for buyers and sellers.
All right, well, welcome back to Before You Buy or Sell a Business. This is Jared Johnson. I have David Barnett here today. So, David, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Jared. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Of course. Yeah, I know. I have to apologize in person, I guess. Well, as much in person as we can get. I canceled on you a couple times and I feel really bad about it. And I'm hoping we can make up for it today. And we've got a lot of good information we can cover.
Listen, I've got so much stuff to do that when things get moved around in my schedule, it just means I get to other stuff faster. So it's just no big deal. I'm glad to finally get together with you.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that. Thanks. And I definitely know how you feel to be busy. So let's just jump right into it. Maybe give us your background, how you got into this crazy world of SMB, M&A, whatever we want to call it this week. So either way, I would love to hear about your background.
Sure. So it started a long time ago, and I actually sort of got into this world by being in the finance brokerage space myself. Now, I live in Canada, so I wasn't doing SBA loans, but I was helping small business owners get equipment finance through capital leases and operating leases, and I was helping people get factoring facilities for accounts receivable. And I was also helping to package up just loan packages for banks, like whether it was for commercial mortgages or financing with a term loan or lines of credit and things like that, doing cash flow forecasts and things like that for people. And I started to run into people that were looking for money to buy businesses. And so I started to become more and more aware that this was a thing. And now we're talking back mid-aughts, so like 2006, 2007, back in those days. And what I saw shocked me. People who really had no idea what they were doing were intermediating deals. And I saw people, get into contracts where they put deposits down and lost the deposits because the person they thought was representing them had no idea what they were doing. I saw people making, offers on businesses without ever considering operating capital needs, and then, becoming successful in buying a business and then actually not having money available to make the thing work, not understanding what the cash conversion cycle was or things of this nature. And so I didn't know how to be a business broker, but I knew that these people didn't know how to be a business broker. And so when the big financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, a lot of the companies I was using sort of as B-grade finance sources went out of business in that crisis. And I realized I had to pivot. And I thought, you know what, maybe I should look at business brokerage and maybe I can do a better job. And I ended up joining with one of the big international franchise brands in the business brokerage world. That gave me access to the IBBA. And so I went through that program and I became the first person around here to be certified to be a broker. And I ran a brokerage here for 3.5 years and I did about 35 deals. And so that's where my background and experience comes from in the deal making space. I left the brokerage industry because being a business broker sucks, Jared. I don't know if you talk to many business brokers, but you can work for a year on a deal and have it fall apart. One of the first businesses I had for sale was a fried chicken franchise that I got at the end of 2008. And it was the last business I sold at the end of 2011 before I decided to hang up my hat. And so I worked on that for 3 years. I sold it 3 times. And the first 2 times that I sold it at the 11th hour, the deals fell apart. And so it's a bitter pill to swallow. And it's frustrating because in the deal making process, if the seller has a good profitable business, if there's a delay in closing, they just make more money. And the buyer usually has a business or a job. And so if the deal is delayed, they just keep earning money in that way. And then the lawyers, the accountants, everybody else, the bankers will have salaries, or they're earning money in other ways too. So these deals get delayed for one reason or another quite often. And the only person who's really like out on a limb without any income is the broker. And everybody in the deal potentially can upset the apple cart and mean that the deal isn't going to close. And I had that happen to me several times. And so I left the brokerage world and I actually became a banker for a while. And people just kept calling me because they were having my name passed along and they were looking for help on a deal. And I kind of started a little bit of consulting on the side, helping people get through these deals, helping buyers and sellers. And then the bank wanted to reorganize and they were offering packages. So I was able to leave and get into this full time. And it's funny. One of the first things I did is I got on YouTube and I started to make videos about some of this stuff, and my channel just celebrated its 11th year. And so I've been in this space for a very, very long time, and it's very interesting how it has changed online. I can tell you that. For the first 5 or 6 years that I was online, I would meet people who were business people in the process of buying or selling a business that were looking for help on very specific aspects of the deal making process. And my business is a consulting business. I mean, we work with buyers and sellers. We have some books that I've written, which are largely sort of part of the marketing funnel. We've also got some online courses that we've put together over the years, which again are kind of part of the marketing funnel. They help bring people to us for consulting. But it was about 5 or 6 years ago when all of a sudden I started to get this new variety of person show up. And it was a person who had no interest whatsoever in business, had never thought about business before, but they ran across some kind of person on the internet telling them that they were foolish and missing out on the biggest opportunity of a lifetime because they weren't out trying to buy a business from a baby boomer. And then it's just been an incredible sea change ever since of people, who are all hyped up, getting excited about this idea and having some pretty incredibly wrong ideas about the world of ETA and about the world of small business. I especially chuckle when I meet people who think that they can buy an existing profitable small business and it's somehow going to be cheap because of what they've been told about sale price multiples, and that they don't need to know anything about it because they can just like magically hire a manager and everything will be great. And unfortunately, I meet some of those people after they've done a deal. And so it's been interesting these last few years, especially with the proliferation of very exciting content on the internet that I think kind of blurs the line between actual educational advice and a form of entertainment. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, you're consuming some of this stuff as well, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously that was a good amount of information. So we'll back up just a little bit really quick. But so, being a broker is very difficult. I did a couple deals here and there. At one point, kind of tried to juggle and just decided, like you, that you got to stick with one thing. But it was sort of nice to see how difficult it is, because I feel like, although it is true that there are some very bad brokers out there, like you sort of alluded to, there are some very good ones as well.
Mm-hmm.
But
There
either
are.
way, it is a very, very challenging environment. Like you mentioned, I mean, you can work on a deal for months, years, and it blow up at the last second, or maybe finally close. And I think some of that is partially due to the way that the brokers are putting the deals together, or the way they're pricing them. I mean, we could probably do a 2-hour episode about that in itself. But I think even kind of further from there, what you brought up was a great point. It is challenging. It is difficult. And I do feel like buyers sometimes beat up the brokers a little too much and don't understand how difficult it is. But sometimes it is deserved. So there's
Well,
a little bit of both
listen,
sides.
listen. There's a whole whack of problems with buyers too. I mean,
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I speak to business brokers as well, and the number of people who've attended one of those weekend $10,000 seminars on how to buy a business with no money, and they're wasting everybody's time is just incredible. I
Yeah.
recently had a guest on my YouTube channel who was trying to sell. He wasn't selling a business. He was trying to sell a few pieces of equipment that he was using in his business, and he was advertising it as though somebody could use it to start a business. And he kept track of all the inquiries he got, And it was incredible the number of inquiries he got from people who literally had no money or experience and called him up and tried to, like, just in the first phone call, tried to get him to give them this stuff on a seller note of some kind. And he finally started saying to them, like, have you been watching YouTube videos that say that this is something you should be able to do? Like, and people would snicker and stuff over the phone. It is getting to a really bad place. The reason why many brokers are maybe short, they're not responsive, et cetera, is because an incredible amount of their time is being wasted by people on the buy side as well. There's no question. There's bad
Yeah.
actors everywhere.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I've sort of the last maybe 18 months been trying to kind of work that angle and trying to get the buyers to be better and the brokers to be better as well. And I do completely agree with you. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it was a lot more of people buying that actually had experience, or they kind of understood that what it takes to operate a business, right? So when they were buying as a lender, it was easier for us to on that side to see kind of like, okay, they have experience, they're trying to buy something, they didn't just find this idea on the internet or out of blue sky or off of social media. It was more of the lending environment was more challenging than it was now, or it is now. And then about 5 years ago is where I started to kind of see more of the search world and ETA kind of come into play. And unfortunately, we had a lot of really bad buyers at that point that did not understand that it was this challenging. And I kind of feel like it's sort of like these things that you see every couple of years, right? So you had like people flipping houses in 2007 and 8, right? Then
Yeah.
you had people doing crypto, then you've had people doing Airbnb, then you've
Well, do you
so
remember the
it's
whole startup thing where everyone
oh
was going to have
yeah,
an app?
oh
That was
yeah,
like 10, 15 years ago.
correct,
I draw the analogy all the time. I say ETA is the next startup thing
yeah.
where there's all this hype about it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I do feel though, and maybe you feel a little bit the same. The last year and a half, 2 years, I have seen it calm down a little bit and clean itself up, at least a little bit. Where I'm seeing better buyers, and the sellers are kind of coming to the table like being a little bit more realistic. But I completely agree. There are some people on social media, kind of running around saying, hey, I own 8 businesses and I bought them all with no money down and the seller carried them all and I installed a manager and I go fishing with my kids every day. And it's like, that is not true. That does not work. And on top of that, I mean, as an SBA lender, we have regulations we have to follow and we're not going to allow that either. So I'm glad that you kind of see the same things that we've had to deal with as well, being in the space. But maybe we could do a couple little question answer
Sure.
relating to the industry, so that we could provide some good advice for people that are listening. So I would say, maybe if you're looking at a deal with a buyer and maybe you've already kind of gone through the process with them, you've understood that they are a real buyer, they've got the capability of buying the business. What are maybe 1 or 2 red flags that you're seeing pop up consistently when you're looking at a deal, just right from the start?
So the biggest red flag for me is when I see SIMs that have no balance sheet information, because it means that the both the seller and maybe the broker as well are completely focused on the P&L, and they just see it as the operational side of it. They see the sales, the cost of sales, the overhead expenses, and they're completely ignoring what the operating capital situation looks like how much money is tied up in inventory and AR and all that kind of stuff. And it's funny because when you press back and you say we need the balance sheets in order to make an offer, a lot of brokers who don't understand these concepts will say, well, why? What do you need that for? And the reason the sellers don't want to share the balance sheets is because they've got things on there like their credit card balances and stuff like that sometimes. And when you try to explain to someone, I need to know how much operating capital is required because that affects the value of the business. If I'm going to buy this thing, in particular, a lot of deals for small businesses are done as asset sales. And a lot of the time the operating capital components are not being transferred over. So if I buy this business and then I got to put in another 300 grand, then my investment just went up by 300 grand. And whether I borrow that money or I put it in cash, it doesn't really matter. My investment has gone up. And so if there's 2 businesses with the same cash flow side by side, and one's going to require a further 300 grand and the other one is not, then the one that doesn't require the extra money is obviously worth more, right?
Right.
Because at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're investing in a cash flow, and we're looking at what we have to invest to acquire the cash flow. And so there's scenarios where there's certain kinds of businesses where there's a lot of operating capital involved, and because the broker either doesn't know or they're ignoring this whole thing, they don't bring that to the conversation. And one of two things will happen: either they'll meet people that ask questions that they don't want to answer, and they'll forego in getting involved with really qualified buyers because the buyer is understanding these concepts. They're qualified. They know what they're doing. Or they will basically accept offers on the business, and then by the time the buyer goes through a process and meets a banker, looks at the numbers, they really get into investigating it. Maybe they even do a QOV, and then they realize the added investment and they realize that the numbers won't work. They'll try to change the deal, and the seller has already got his number kind of pegged at where he thought he was going to get for the business, and then they don't want to negotiate again. The deal falls apart, and these things just kind of like stay on the market, and they go through this cycle a few times, and time just ticks by. And usually when someone puts a business up for sale, they have a reason for wanting to sell it, and a lot of the times those reasons are not durable over time. So if you've got someone with poor health, a family concern, a marriage concern, the need to they have to relocate, or they're burned out in some way, making them stay an extra 3 years while they go through this cycle with 3 different people is not going to be good for them or the business. And unfortunately, these things don't end up being sold. The other big red flag that I see is when people completely ignore CapEx. It's funny that we use SDE or EBITDA as the cash flow basis for valuing small businesses. And I was listening to a podcast about 2 months ago where one of the big online influencer gurus that we were just alluding to was on there saying that small businesses sold for 2.5 to 3 times profit. And it made me chuckle because SDE is not profit. It's
Right.
not. It is a budget. And it's a budget from which you need to take a salary home for yourself, service any debt. You got to pay your taxes from that money. You also have to get a rate of return on the cash you put into the deal. And you've got to take care of capital equipment, because in order to get SDE or EBITDA, we're adding back depreciation and amortization. And that's how accountants sort of describe the capital equipment, the fixed assets, wearing out. And so if you've got a little corner store with a couple of coolers and some shelves, obviously the CapEx of that business is very different from somebody who's running heavy equipment to put foundations in for houses, right? And so this is another place where I'll see inexperienced brokers in particular try to find some kind of benchmark for value as a multiple of SDE or EBITDA for this kind of business that has a lot of equipment. They'll just multiply that number and say, here's what the business is worth. And again, inexperienced buyers might organize a deal on that basis, but by the time they start talking to bankers and lenders, et cetera, they soon begin to realize that a huge chunk of that EBITDA has to actually go to replacing the heavy machinery that wears out, like a tractor or a backhoe or something. It's only got a certain amount of hours in it before it's probably got to be replaced. And all of that CapEx comes out of cash flow. And so when I work with my buyers and we're looking at a business like this, one of the things we look at is we look at the plant and equipment. We look at the replacement cost of the major pieces of plant and equipment. If it's what we call a business with a fleet, imagine that foundation company again. If there's like 12 big items and you know that you need to replace a couple a year, well, it's really easy to make a budget there. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a year have to come off of that SDE or EBITDA to account for replacing that equipment. If it's a business like, let's say it's some kind of a little wholesale place and they have 2 delivery trucks, that's very different because, depending on the mileage, et cetera, you can get a longer life out of that truck. And so what we'll do in that scenario is we'll look at what it might cost to lease a new truck, and we'll use that lease payment as a stand-in crutch for the CapEx investment. We'll say, you can buy this business, but when that truck wears out, we're going to already have taken into account a payment that you need to make to lease yourself a replacement vehicle. And we kind of built that into our valuation model. So it's about showing the buyers what kinds of things are going to come up that will actually cost them money. that the brokerage community, because, and I'm not going to point fingers at the brokers and say they're bad for doing this. I understand how EBITDA and SDE came to be. And I know that in the world of small business, there are so few conventions in how people manage the numbers of their companies that it's really tough, outside of certain industry rules of thumb that have evolved for specific kinds of businesses. But it's really tough to create some kind of general methodology for evaluating these things. And so we've ended up using SDE and EBITDA for valuing these things. And I think that's okay. The problem is when these buyers that are new come into this field and they look at those numbers and they somehow confuse these numbers with profit. And they certainly are not.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up a lot of really good points, and I totally agree with you. And I think really what it comes down to is that people aren't they're just looking, going, oh, it's a 3x multiple, that's great, but they're not looking and saying, okay, what is it going to take to actually run this business? What is the cash cycle? How is the equipment? How are they getting paid? When are they getting paid? All those other factors that come into play, where they likely need to get in there, make some real adjustments, and then decide, does it make sense to move forward? I saw something one time where Warren Buffett said whenever he looks at a company, he takes out depreciation. And so when he's factoring in what it really is, he's not using depreciation, because the way he looks at it is, if there's depreciation, there's likely equipment that needs to be continually replaced. And so if you don't add back depreciation, then you're sort of factoring in the CapEx right away. And he said even sometimes when he's looking at it, not even including that, there are times where you're getting in kind of where that business is selling, and a lot of that equipment has been, maybe set aside, and they should have been doing the work to, either replace it or recondition it, and they haven't been. And so sometimes even when you take that out, it's not enough. And so I guess, so what I would say is, okay, so you get a lot of buyers, and I don't know about you, but
Can we talk
go
about
ahead.
Warren Buffett's comment there? Because
Absolutely.
I love it, because half the time I mention depreciation, someone makes that reference to Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett looks at publicly traded companies. He's looking at very big firms. And the way that, say, a trucking company with 1,000 rigs, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, their accountants, what they're doing is they are using the declining balance depreciation methodology or what have you. But because they have 1,000 rigs, they've got to buy like 200 a year or whatever it is to like keep this fleet renewed. And so the accountant's way of calculating depreciation on these big publicly traded companies actually comes up with a number that approximates the true CapEx. And this is how the accountants came up with it. The problem is when you bring yourself into the world of small business. When President Trump was elected the first time, he brought about those tax changes, which included the bonus and rapid depreciation that small businesses could do. And so, as soon as you're now buying equipment and depreciating the entire thing in 1 year, that you realize that the depreciation line item on the P&L actually is meaningless. It doesn't relate in any way to the lifespan of that truck. It's now just an accounting trick. And so this is why, Warren Buffett's comment doesn't apply in the world of small business, because small business owners are going to often do whatever they feel is the most tax advantageous thing in the moment. That might
Yeah.
mean that they're going to bonus depreciate everything all at once, so they save taxes in that year. And so then you get a big depreciation 1 year, the next year you get none. And it's like, well, which number do I use? And that's why I think that we need to come up with these reasonable CapEx budgets that are based upon a logical understanding of what's going on in the business. And your point about the deferred maintenance is the way I refer to it. So somebody realizes, hey, I'm going to sell my business in 5 years. I'm not going to buy anything new. I'm going to let everything run down. Well, a lot of the time, people will make an offer on a business based on financial stuff before they get into due diligence, where they would learn that some of that equipment has been run down. And so this is an important part of the due diligence process, is physical due diligence. And it's something that people forget. And I've seen a lot of buyers will negotiate for a business, then they'll engage a Q of E firm. The Q of E firm is going to get knee deep in receipts and paperwork and bank statements and everything like that. And people will close on a deal without ever having had a mechanic or a technician go out and see the field equipment and give some kind of report as to the lifespan expectancy or what repairs may be needed or the state of the transmission on, the big rig or whatever it is. And that kind of stuff is critical. I always liken it to the roof on a house. I don't know if I pronounced that properly. The roof on a house, like how do you say that? Anyway, so I asked an appraiser once, is it going to add to the value of my house if I install new shingles? And he said, not really, but if it leaks, it'll certainly affect the value of the house. And that's the way I liken it to business owners. I'm like, if you don't keep up the fleet of capital equipment in your business to some kind of good standard that is going to be durable, then people are going to want to then discount the price of the business when they realize they got to fork out another couple $100,000 to replace some things right away. And so the flip side, when I get business owners who say, I just bought these 3 new things, I want to sell my business for more. Well, you can try. It's going to be difficult. I always point out to people that what is being purchased is a cash flow. And at the end of the day, people expect that they're going to get everything they need to make the cash flow flow.
Right. If you don't have the equipment, you don't have a business. And
Yeah.
that's a lot of times where, and I feel like it's gotten a little bit better over the last couple of years, but it used to be you would get these sims and it would say, okay, we're doing 3x, SDE plus $500,000 in inventory plus $500,000 in equipment. I'm like, if you don't have the inventory, you don't have the equipment, you don't have SDE, there's no goodwill. So no, you need to buy the business as if you were going to take over day one and be able to operate it and produce the SDE. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. But yeah, I think that was great, a great point. And again, I mean, I guess the other 2 cents to add to it is just really getting the buyers to understand that every single deal is different. So you could buy 2, exactly the same, concrete companies. One could have all brand new equipment and one could have stuff that is, 6, 7 years old that all needs to be replaced. And you need to be able to pay attention to that. You don't just look at the SDE and look at a multiple or just look at the customer base or the employees. Those are all great things to look at, but you really need to figure out, what is this business going to look like in the first 12, 24, 36 months? And what am I going to have to spend money on? Because if I don't understand day one what I'm spending on, you could get yourself in some big trouble as soon as you walk into that business.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So a lot of times what I hear and what I've noticed over the years is that you have people that are searching for a business, whether they're doing it full time, part time, keeping their job, however they're doing it. There comes a point where they get a little tired, they get burned out, they may look at a transaction and have a very different response than they did 18 months prior. And when they're looking at it, they may be willing to kind of sweep some of the red flags under the rug because they're tired of looking. What would you tell someone like that? And how would you kind of come into play on helping with some of those issues?
I would give them my mailing address so they can just send me the money. Like,
All right.
the world of buying and selling a small business, the marketplace, as it were, for small businesses, is probably the least transparent market that there is. On the stock market, we know every minute what the shares of these big companies are worth because we've got this incredibly vast information system that is always telling us at every moment what somebody was willing to pay for that stock. And in the world of small business, we've got none of that. We don't even know what's for sale. We don't know what sold last week. You talked about 2 businesses being across the street from each other. You drive down any industrial park road, you're going to find similar businesses, and you don't know that one of them sold last year and another one might be up for sale next year. Like, it's just completely secretive and hidden, and you just don't know. And that is what makes it so wonderful, because the people that are willing to do the work are the ones that are going to turn up the opportunities that could eventually become quite lucrative. And just like any endeavor, work is hard. It takes effort. I have sort of a sliding scale of whether or not you should have an appetite for deals that have hair or red flags on them. And it works kind of like this. The first business you're going to buy, you can't afford to mess up, because especially if you're going to leave your job and go run that business, because if you mess up, then you have lost your income stream and you've signed a personal guarantee on a loan, and if it was really bad, you could be heading to bankruptcy court to try to have this situation resolved. And that's going to close the door to any future deals for you for a long time, right? Whereas if you get the first deal done well, if you invest the time and effort to find a good business and you buy it under reasonable terms and conditions for the right price, and you get the support from the seller and you have expertise and knowledge that's going to improve that business, et cetera, well, then you're going to be okay. And then you might decide to grow one day through acquisition. You might buy another one and another one. So I've got a client who's in my group coaching program, and he has just done his fifth deal. And this is the one, Jared, where he's uncovered fraud. He even had a CPA work with the seller to file incorrect tax returns, like the whole shebang, everything that we
Oh my
hear
gosh.
as far as horror stories. But it's business number five, and the first four make money. And so he can afford this. He can afford to live through these problems. Has acquired a customer base. He did structure the deal with a material amount of seller financing. So we're not talking about a 10% note, like a material amount. And he put the seller on notice that because of the discrepancies between what is really in the business and what was, presented, he won't be making any more payments on his note. So he had recourse. He was able to salvage it to some degree, but he's got the staying power because he's got those other businesses that are producing good cash flow. And these are all in the same industry, by the way. So he didn't, stretch himself outside of the area of his familiarity or anything like that. So that's kind of the sliding scale. The more experienced you are, the better able you're going to be to analyze and sometimes even run a business better than the seller. I've got another client who buys special care, home care businesses rather, and they now have several of them in many states. And so when he goes in and looks at one of these businesses, they not only do a due diligence, but they usually come back with a grocery list of all the things that they think that they're going to improve when they implement their systems into the business. And so that buyer, he doesn't need the seller at all, right? He's completely independent. He's got a team now that even does transition. So it's this sliding scale. And if you are the newbie, if you are the starter, you can't afford a mess up. In my opinion, though, there's got to be a lot of Warren Buffett quotes out there about not making mistakes and losing your capital, and I would refer people to those ones. It's funny because I mentioned how there was this change about 5 years ago in the type of people I was meeting. Earlier in my career in this business, I was meeting middle-aged people that had significant net worths, and they had business experience and backgrounds that led them to be experts in the businesses they were looking at buying. And they were very prudent buyers, and they didn't do bad deals if they could avoid them. And they had something to lose, so that they took the personal guarantees very seriously. What I've encountered more of late is these like 20 something searchers who don't have any degree of net worth. They haven't had time yet to accumulate many assets, and they haven't had much time to accumulate any real life experience either. And, I've had more than one of them express to me, hey, why wouldn't I borrow 90% to buy this business if I can get the SBA to approve it? Like, I've got nothing to lose. And I can kind of see that point of view. But my counter to that would be you've got a decade to lose. Because if you mess it up and you end up defaulting, your credit history is going to be ruined, and then this door will effectively be closed to you for a good long time. What would that be, like 8 years or something, like until it falls
At
off the
least,
credit
yeah.
report?
Yeah.
Have you done a loan to someone who had a history of bankruptcy that you could see?
Um, very, very few. And normally it was tied to something, drastic that happened in their life, whether it was like fraud or divorce or medical related. And
Mm-hmm.
it's been 20, 30 years, and they've been able to kind of learn their lesson and prove that they weren't what I usually call a repeat offender, where they're, you know, tending
So
to
you're
do it
talking
over
about
and
an
over and
even
over again.
longer time frame of
Yeah,
of
yeah. Most of the
penance.
time, if it's only been 7 to 10 years, we're usually not gonna be too comfortable with that, unless they can show us that there was something crazy that happened, and they've really learned their lesson since that point, and they can kind of demonstrate it. But we're always going to be really, really careful with that.
There's an underlying notion that buying a business is somehow a risk-free thing. And what I want to set straight in people who may be listening is that if you buy a business, you're going to get existing customers. clientele or customer risk is just one of a vast array of risks that exist in a business. We've got operational risks, you've got market risks, a new competitor could come into town, you got regulatory risks. If you have any kind of licensing or there's government rules about your business, those rules could change. People who use steel right now have, all of a sudden there's these tariffs, right? So like their costs have gone up. Like all of this stuff is beyond the control of people who own these businesses. And so when you buy a business, you're hopping right into the middle of all those risks. And the current business owners manage those risks through their experience and wisdom that they built up over the years dealing with these things one after the other as they come up to bite them. And you're jumping into it maybe without that experience, without having lived through it before. But the thing is that when you buy a business, you bring with you a risk that the seller usually doesn't have, and that is the finance risk. And so a lot of these successful small businesses have incredibly strong balance sheets. Here we are back at the balance sheet, which means they've got really low debt to equity ratios because they have paid down their debts over the course of time. They've accumulated lots and lots of assets. And so when things go awry, that seller, if his SDE is 500 grand, like, yeah, he's paying taxes and all that kind of stuff, but he's taking a lot of money home and he's got a lot of money that he can use to fight problems that we're describing. You buy that business and you apply 90% leverage to it. Well, now your balance sheet is incredibly weak. And a huge chunk of that SDE has now just been, sort of assigned to go towards the bank payments. And you now have disarmed yourself with one of the most powerful tools for problem solving in business, which is just like throwing money at a problem, right?
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that I think a lot of these new people they don't quite get. They think that because the track record is there, that it's going to be easy for them, and they feel that I'll tell you a quick story. This is not a client of mine, but I was at a meeting of some other consultants 2 weeks ago. This is a business in New England. There were a group of 4 people who bought the business, so they were investors, let's call them. And the business had been run for a long time, many decades, by its current owner. And there was a second in command who was like the VP of operations that ran the facilities and served the customers, all that kind of stuff. So these 4 investors bought the business and they promoted that VP of operations to the general manager. Over the last year, this guy's got 20 years experience too. He knows how to run that plant. And he knows how to serve the customers. But over the course of the first year in business, they've gone from revenues of about 3.5 million down to 2.6. So he's shrunk the company by almost $1 million in revenue. And 4 investors now are facing a capital call of 125,000 each. So they put in money to buy the business, they borrowed a bunch of money, and now they've all got to come up with additional money. And the problem is that the person who now is the general manager, while he understood his part of the business, he didn't understand all the parts that the owner was doing. And the buyers don't understand the business. They really believed, the story that they could buy a business, put a manager in charge, and everything would be just great. And it's not. And so that manager they put in place is on a learning curve to try to figure out what they need to know. The investors now have put even more in. And what I find so interesting about this idea of buying a business and putting a manager in place is that for most people, a small business acquisition represents an incredibly outsized investment, right? Like if you are working a job and you're earning 100 grand a year and you're managing to save 10 or 15,000, you're putting that money into some kind of portfolio of stocks, for example. You're not borrowing $1 million to put into one stock. Very few stockbrokers would let you do that kind of strategy.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing you're doing when you buy a small business. You're putting in a down payment, you're borrowing another $1 million, and now you've got this one investment that's highly leveraged that is completely outsized to the size of your income usually, right? And I don't see many people doing that kind of thing and then just handing the keys to somebody else. Anyway, that's my opinion on that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I want to go back to one thing real quick. So you brought up the type of buyer that you see from time to time. And I agree, I see the same ones. What do you normally tell them if they don't have the experience, the capital, the net worth that would help them along, if they got into some trouble? What do you usually tell them? Do you tell them to come back? Do you tell them keep moving forward? Do you tell them to go work somewhere? What do you usually give them as far as advice?
If they're hell bent on doing it, and I will teach them what I can on how they can how try to mitigate the risk. But when somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I just got out of university, I'm 23, and I think I'm going to buy a business instead of get a job," what I'll do is I'll point out that they can get paid to develop experience, knowledge, and wisdom with no risk, and that's by getting a job, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'll say to them is like, look at what you might be interested in. Look at the array of industries that are out there and look at whether those industries are dominated by these big companies or there's a plethora of small independent operators out there. So, like grocery stores versus auto repair, right? Big chains in the grocery world, auto repair, lots of independent operators. Well, if you think that you might like auto repair and you think you might want to own an auto repair business, well, get a job in that world and learn what it's really like. Learn what those challenges are that people face in those businesses. Get to know people who might be able to help you. I have worked on deals before where people have been managers and supervisors in a certain industry. They've gotten to know the representatives of like the wholesalers or the manufacturers, and they've actually gotten assistance from a manufacturer in doing an acquisition because the manufacturer wants to secure that
Mm.
acquisition as a new client and they're willing to help the buyer. Nobody from outside the industry would be able to pull that off. It's only because the manufacturer and the agents that represent it know this person over the course of time and are kind of like vouching for him, like, yeah, I know that guy. He's been working at this place for a long time. I think he does good. He's got a good reputation. If he's going to do this deal and we can support him by fronting him, $100,000 of inventory on 180-day terms, we should do that to help the guy out because we'll secure his account for years, right? And those kinds of creative things only happen when people are known in their industry and have a chance to develop roots and and get the connections, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I know we're sort of bringing a lot of the issues or things that could come up in this talk, but do you still feel that buying a business is the right investment, or maybe is it the right investment for a certain person? And if you feel like it's for a certain person, maybe describe that person.
Yeah, I think buying businesses is for business people. And so one of the questions that I ask people is, how long have you dreamed of owning a business? How many childhood businesses did you operate? What businesses do you dream of? You'll sometimes run into someone who will say, I've always wanted to have a business. I just can't figure out what I'd want to get into. And then there's other people who say, I have trouble focusing because 5 times a day I get a new business idea and I have to learn how to discard those ideas, right? And it's a spectrum. And I think that, if you are interested in business, and that doesn't have to be an interest from childhood, it might evolve over time. But if you're interested in business and you want to learn about business and you go looking to take bigger and bigger responsibilities in your employed life, you go looking for ways to have a bigger impact where you work, you go out of your way to learn about other parts of the company where you work or other industries, et cetera, and you have that interest and that thirst and that hunger, then you're probably a business person. And then the question is, do I start or do I buy? And I think that you have to look at both pathways and consider each at every step along the way. When I got started way back when, I used to tell people it was less risky to buy a business because you already had the customers. But people weren't paying the kinds of prices they're paying today. The,
Right.
the prices have moved up in a direct reaction to the noise on the internet that is being made about how this is such a great opportunity. And there's a bunch of lies out there. And so one of the big lies is about the silver tsunami, that all these baby boomers are going to retire. That's not a lie. Baby boomers are going to retire. The lie is that there's not enough new people to buy all these businesses that they
Oh
have.
yeah.
And the issue is that 80% of those boomer businesses are not worth buying. Like they're
Hmm.
just not transferable businesses, right? But that lie is being used to pull people into the space who know nothing about businesses and nothing about operating a business. And they're somehow feeling that they're going to miss out on this big wealth transfer if they don't learn how to fill out an SBA loan application, right? And so,
Yeah.
I think you should be a business person. You should be interested in business. And at every step along the way, one of the gut check questions I always ask is, what would it cost to replicate this? What would it cost if you started this? Like, I've done consultations with people who've wanted to buy HVAC firms with like 4 employees for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I would say to them, like, there's 4 guys. One competitor could meet them at the coffee truck and you could lose the whole company in one coffee break if with the right job offer. Like, does it really make sense to spend this kind of money when you could be the guy at the coffee truck hiring them away if the business basically is the labor, right? Another question that I often ask is, why are you the lucky person to get this opportunity? So someone will bring me something like, oh, I found this great deal on this tire shop. And I'm like, tire shop? There's lots of tire shops. In fact, there are tire shops in the neighboring towns around this town. Why aren't one of those tire shops buying this? How come you're the lucky guy that gets to buy this tire shop instead of someone who really knows the tire business? And for some people, it's a real head scratcher. But the thing is that you never get what's fair in anything. You get what you negotiate. And I find that the experienced business people who have stuff on the go for themselves, they will look at a business, they'll look at an opportunity, they'll figure out what it's worth to them, and they'll make an offer. And the people who don't quite know what they're doing are going to be much more influenced by things like the asking price and trying to figure out how they can bridge the gap from where they are to meeting the seller on the seller's terms, instead of figuring out what makes sense to them and making that offer with the comfort of knowing that other people might offer more, but hey, those deals might fall apart. And I'm just going to have to wait and see if I get an opportunity later. And it's okay to let other people do dumb deals because it means that there's fewer dumb buyers competing with you for the next one.
Yeah, exactly. Those some really great points. I feel like you and I could go on for 3 hours. So maybe we need to do a follow-up episode.
I'd love that.
I've appreciated your time. I always ask 2 questions at the end. So first one, do you have a mentor or have you ever had a mentor?
It's a great question. When I got into business brokerage, I was lucky enough that I was able to learn some stuff from Ed Pendarvis, who is the guy who founded Sunbelt Business Brokers. So it was like a page out of the 1970s business brokerage world, and so I got to learn a lot of sort of the old school salesmanship type ideas that Ed learned when he was coming up through the ranks and kind of building this business. I mean, he was one of the sort of the originals that kind of gave it the shape that it has today. And what I really gained a greater appreciation for the strategy and the diligence and the strategies to take care of yourself as a buyer when I met a guy named Ted Leverett. Ted at one point had a chain of business buyer consultancies, and he's still around online on LinkedIn and stuff sharing advice. But those 2 guys and had a real impact on me when I was learning this craft.
Cool. Yeah, it's always good for them to pass it along. So last question that we normally ask, what motivates you? You've been successful, you've helped a lot of people, what keeps you going?
The mission of our company is to help people avoid bad deals. So when I started making videos on YouTube, I got an email from a lady who saw one of my videos and she said, I wish I had seen this video 3 years ago because our family lost $300,000 doing a bad deal. And the thing that was wrong with our deal was what you described in the video. And if I had seen this video, I wouldn't have made that mistake. And
Wow.
the expression "time is money" really hit home to me there because it was an immigrant family and they had spent decades in their home country accumulating this wealth, and they moved to North America and they put that money into a business deal without really knowing what they were doing or having the right kind of education, and they got into a bad deal and they lost that money. So that seller took those decades of labor from them.
Wow.
Time is money. And
Absolutely.
and that is the kind of thing that I'm trying to help our clients avoid. And it's not just buyers, Jared. And this is what I think is really important for people in your audience to understand. The same thing happens to sellers. The same thing happens to sellers when they get misled on what the value of their business is. So one of the saddest things that I ever run across for someone trying to sell a business is when they'll reach out to me because they've had a business up for sale for 2 or 3 years. They haven't been able to sell it. They'll start asking questions, typing things into the internet, and they'll run across my videos and they'll reach out to me and they'll say, can you help show me why no one's buying my business? And they'll send over the sim that some broker has prepared. And I'll look through it and I'll say, look, your business is worth about 300 grand and you're asking 740. That's why it hasn't sold.
Yep.
And I'll say, here's a reasonable deal for you. You might take this amount down. You might expect to have a seller note for this amount paid over this many years. That would make sense for a buyer who looks like this, a buyer who's 20 years younger, who used to be a manager in someone else's business like yours. And some of these guys will go, oh my God, a guy offered that to me 8 months in. And I said no, because I didn't know it was a reasonable offer. And in that case, that seller had just had wasted years. He wanted to sell because his wife had a chronic illness. He wanted to get into retirement early so he could spend more time with her. And instead, he had to keep running this business because he was expecting that the next time the phone rang, it was going to be someone who was going to be willing to pay the price that he had been told the business was worth. And his expectations had been led astray. And again, in that scenario, it had cost him years of his life that he wanted to live in a different way.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So, okay, so you've referenced your YouTube channel a bunch of times. How can people find you?
Yeah, if you go on YouTube or any of the podcast apps and you just type David Barnett Small Business, you'll find me right away. I'm all over the place, and I've got all kinds of great resources. We just had a release of the second edition of one of my books, How to Sell My Own Business. So if anyone out there owns a business, if you go to howtosellmyownbusiness.com, you can find a link there to download a PDF of the book for free. Or if you prefer to read it on paper, you can get it on Amazon now too. Just make sure you look for the 2025 release.
Cool. Okay. Well, hopefully we can get people to look you up and save themselves some time and some money. And I really appreciate you coming on. And, if there's anything we can do to help you out in the future, please let us know.
Thanks, Jared. It's been a pleasure today. Good to meet you.
You as well.
Thank you all for listening to Before You Buy or Sell a Business. If you found value in this episode, please follow the show, leave a positive review, and share it with someone. For more information, check out jaredwjohnson.com. We'll see you all next time.